Duke Harmon's massive frame cast a shadow across Main Street as he stood perfectly still, watching the elegant woman step down from the stagecoach. His weathered hand instinctively moved to the silver locket hidden beneath his shirt, the one he'd carried for 15 years, the one that held her picture from when she was just a girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Isabelle Crane had returned to Dustwater, and she had no idea that the town's most feared man had been her silent protector all these years. What she was about to discover would shake the very foundations of everything she thought she knew about loyalty, love, and the giant cowboy everyone said was heartless. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The autumn wind swept through Dustwater's dusty streets, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. Isabelle Crane adjusted her emerald traveling dress and surveyed the town she'd left behind as a child, noting how little had changed in the 15 years since her departure to Boston society. The same weathered buildings lined the main thoroughfare, the same hand-painted signs creaked in the breeze, and the same curious stares followed her every movement. What struck her most, however, was the silence that seemed to descend upon the townsfolk as she made her way toward the lawyer's office to settle Aunt Margaret's estate. "Miss Crane," called Sheriff Reynolds, tipping his hat with a politeness that seemed forced. "Mighty sorry about your aunt. She was a good woman." His words carried an undertone that suggested her own reputation might not share the same charitable assessment. Isabelle had heard the whispers during her journey west, the rumors that painted her as a frivolous socialite who'd abandoned her roots for the glittering ballrooms of high society. She lifted her chin and nodded graciously, determined not to let small-town gossip affect her composure. The law office of Preston Associates occupied a narrow building squeezed between the general store and the barber shop. Mr. Preston himself, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, greeted her with the enthusiasm one might reserve for a particularly unpleasant dental procedure. "Ms. Crane, your aunt's affairs are, shall we say, complicated." He shuffled through papers with the deliberate slowness of someone who clearly wished she would simply sign everything and leave town immediately. "There's the matter of the property taxes, the outstanding debts, and then there's the issue with Duke Harmon." At the mention of that name, Isabelle felt a strange flutter in her chest, though she couldn't place why. "I'm not familiar with Mr. Harmon. What exactly is the issue?" She settled into the uncomfortable wooden chair across from Preston's desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap, despite the growing tension in her shoulders. Preston cleared his throat nervously. "Duke Harmon owns the largest ranch in the county, and he's been, well, protective of your aunt's land. There have been several attempts by outside investors to purchase the property, and Harmon has, shall we say, discouraged their efforts through various means." End quote. The lawyer's euphemistic language couldn't quite mask what sounded like intimidation tactics, which only added to Isabelle's confusion about why a stranger would involve himself in her family's affairs. "What kind of various means?" Isabelle pressed, her Boston finishing school training in polite persistence serving her well. She'd learned that men often revealed more when questioned with gentle but unwavering determination. Broken wagon wheels, spooked horses, and a general sense that conducting business in Dustwater might be hazardous to one's health, Preston admitted reluctantly. "The man's built like a mountain, and has a reputation for violence, though I've never personally witnessed anything that could be proven in a court of law." He removed his spectacles and cleaned them meticulously, clearly uncomfortable with the entire conversation. As if summoned by their discussion, the sound of heavy boots on the wooden sidewalk outside drew their attention to the window. A shadow fell across the glass, and Isabelle found herself looking up at a man who seemed to defy the very laws of human proportion. Duke Harmon stood at least 7 feet tall, with shoulders that could have carried a full-grown steer and hands that looked capable of crushing stone. His dark hair fell in waves to his collar, and a well-trimmed beard framed a face that might have been carved from granite. Most striking, however, were his eyes, a deep blue that seemed to hold secrets and sorrows in equal measure. Those eyes found hers through the window, and for a moment that stretched far longer than propriety would allow, they simply stared at each other. Isabelle felt a jolt of recognition that made no logical sense, as if she were remembering something from a half-forgotten dream. Duke's expression remained carefully neutral, but she caught a flicker of something, perhaps surprise or longing, before he touched the brim of his hat in a respectful nod and continued down the street. "That's him," Preston whispered unnecessarily. "Duke Harmon. Been living on that ranch for near 20 years. Keeps to himself mostly. Some say he came here running from something back east. Others claim he's got Indian blood, though nobody's brave enough to ask him directly." The lawyer's voice carried the breathless quality of someone sharing particularly scandalous gossip. Isabelle found herself still staring out the window long after the giant man had disappeared from view. Something about him stirred a memory she couldn't quite grasp, like trying to recall the details of a childhood dream. "Has he ever explained why he's interested in protecting my aunt's land?" she asked, though she suspected Preston would have no satisfactory answer. "Your aunt never spoke of it, and Duke Harmon isn't the sort of man one questions casually," Preston replied with a shrug. "All I know is that whenever someone showed up with papers and big city money, hoping to buy that land cheap, they found themselves facing down Duke Harmon. Most decided their business interests lay elsewhere after that first encounter." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of legal documents and financial obligations that Isabelle signed with growing bewilderment. Her aunt's modest estate included a small house on the outskirts of town and 40 acres of seemingly unremarkable grazing land. Hardly the sort of property that should attract aggressive investors or mysterious all-eye protectors. As she prepared to leave the lawyer's office, Preston handed her a sealed envelope with her name written in her aunt's familiar handwriting. "She left specific instructions that you were to receive this only after we discussed the business matters," he explained, his curiosity clearly piqued by the mysterious correspondence. Outside the law office, Isabelle paused on the wooden sidewalk and carefully opened the envelope. Her aunt's letter was brief, but puzzling. "My dearest Isabelle, if you're reading this, then Duke has kept his promise all these years. The truth about your protector lies in your childhood memories of the summer you spent with me when you were 8 years old. Look for the oak tree by Miller's Creek, and remember the boy who saved you from drowning. Some debts can only be repaid with a lifetime of devotion. Trust him, my dear. He's been watching over you far longer than you know. All my love, Aunt Margaret." The letter raised more questions than it answered, and Isabelle found herself walking slowly toward the small house that had been her sanctuary during that long-ago summer. The building looked smaller than she remembered, its white paint now faded to a soft gray, but the flower garden her aunt had tended with such care still bloomed with late-season roses and chrysanthemums. As she fumbled with the key Preston had provided, she became aware of a presence behind her. "Miss Crane." The voice was deep and carefully modulated, with the hint of an accent she couldn't identify. She turned to find Duke Harmon standing a respectful distance away, his massive frame somehow managing not to appear threatening despite his intimidating size. "I wanted to offer my condolences about your aunt. She was a fine woman who spoke of you often." Up close, his features were even more striking than she'd observed through the window. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd spent his life outdoors, but there was an intelligence in his blue eyes that suggested depths far beyond the simple rancher he appeared to be. Most intriguing was the way he looked at her, not with the calculating assessment she'd grown accustomed to from men in Boston society, but with a kind of careful reverence, as if she were something precious he'd been entrusted to protect. "Thank you, Mr. Harmon," she replied, finding her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I understand you've been, shall we say, helpful in managing certain business matters related to my aunt's property." She watched his reaction carefully, noting the slight tightening around his eyes at her diplomatic phrasing. "Your aunt was a good neighbor," he said simply. "I don't care for outsiders who come here thinking they can take advantage of honest folks." There was steel beneath his quiet words, and Isabelle began to understand why potential investors had found their business ventures in Dustwater suddenly complicated by unforeseen obstacles. "Mr. Preston mentioned that several parties have expressed interest in purchasing the land," she said, testing the waters of his knowledge. "Do you know what makes my aunt's property so attractive to outside investors?" Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to survey the distant mountains that ringed the valley. When he spoke, his words were measured and careful. "There's been talk of a railroad spur coming through this area. connecting the mining operations up in the hills to the main line. Land that's worthless for grazing might suddenly become very valuable for commerce. Tao. He paused, his eyes returning to hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Your aunt believed the land should stay in local hands, not be sold to speculators who'd strip it bare for profit. The explanation made practical sense, but Isabelle sensed there were layers to the story he wasn't sharing. Before she could probe further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the street. 3 men in expensive suits rode into town on horses that were clearly too fine for the rough country, their bearing suggesting they were unaccustomed to the discomforts of frontier travel. "Speak of the devil," Duke muttered under his breath, his posture shifting subtly as he positioned himself between Isabelle and the newcomers. She noticed how his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. The lead rider, a man with silver hair and cold gray eyes, dismounted and approached them with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of money and intimidation. "Miss Crane, I presume?" "I'm Harrison Blackwood of Blackwood Development Company. I've traveled all the way from Denver to discuss a business proposition that could benefit us both considerably." Isabelle felt Duke tense beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm afraid I've only just arrived in town, Mr. Blackwood. I'm hardly prepared to discuss business matters at this moment." She employed the same politely dismissive tone she'd perfected for dealing with persistent suitors in Boston social circles. Of course," Blackwood replied smoothly, though his smile never reached his eyes. "Perhaps we could arrange to meet tomorrow? I'm prepared to offer you twice the assessed value of your property, cash on delivery. You could be back in Boston by the end of the week, considerably wealthier and free of the burdens of managing frontier real estate." His tone suggested he considered his offer generous beyond reason, and his confidence implied he'd never encountered a situation where money couldn't solve any problem. "That's very generous," Isabelle said carefully. "But I haven't had time to fully assess my aunt's estate or my obligations to the community." She could feel Duke's approval radiating from beside her, though he remained silent and watchful. Blackwood's smile faltered slightly, revealing a flash of irritation at her failure to immediately accept his offer. "Miss Crane, I hope you won't allow sentiment to cloud your business judgment. This is a significant opportunity, and I'd hate to see you make a decision you might later regret." The subtle threat in his words was unmistakable, and Isabelle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Blackwood, but I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs," she replied, allowing a touch of steel to enter her voice. Years of navigating Boston society had taught her how to deal with men who mistook politeness for weakness. Duke finally spoke, his voice carrying a quiet menace that made even the horses shift nervously. "The lady has made her position clear, Blackwood. I suggest you respect her wishes and give her the time she needs to make her decision." Though he hadn't moved or raised his voice, something in his tone made all 3 men take an instinctive step backward. Blackwood's face darkened with anger, but he was clearly intelligent enough to recognize a dangerous man when he encountered one. "Of course, Mr. Harmon. I wouldn't dream of pressuring Miss Crane." His words were directed at Duke, and the familiarity suggested this wasn't their first encounter. "However, I should mention that my company has already invested considerable resources in this area, and we're committed to moving forward with our development plans. I do hope Miss Crane won't find herself in a position where she's the only holdout against progress." After the men remounted and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and unspoken threats hanging in the air, Isabelle turned to Duke with renewed curiosity. "They seem to know you quite well," she observed, hoping to encourage him to reveal more about his previous encounters with the developers. "We've had some discussions," he said shortly, his expression grim. "Blackwood's been circling this valley like a vulture for months, buying up properties from folks who can't afford to say no to his offers. Your aunt's land was one of the last pieces he needed for his railroad development." He paused, studying her face with that same careful intensity she'd noticed before. She refused to sell, no matter how high he pushed the price. Something in his tone made Isabelle ask, "And you supported her decision?" Though the question seemed obvious given his actions, she sensed there were personal motivations behind his involvement that went beyond simple neighborly concern. Duke was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain and carefully guarded secrets. "Your aunt saved my life once, a long time ago. I owed her a debt that money couldn't repay." He touched his hat politely and began to turn away. "If you need anything while you're settling her affairs, my ranch is about 5 miles north of town. Anyone can point you in the right direction." As he walked away, Isabelle found herself staring after his retreating figure with a mixture of fascination and frustration. Every answer he provided seemed to raise 2 new questions, and she was beginning to suspect that understanding Duke Harmon was the key to unraveling the mysteries surrounding her aunt's property and her own unexpectedly complex situation in Dustwater. That evening, as she explored her aunt's house by lamplight, Isabelle discovered that many of her childhood memories had been preserved with touching care. Her aunt had kept drawings she'd made during that summer visit, pressed flowers from walks they'd taken together, and even a small collection of smooth stones she'd gathered from Miller's Creek. Each memento triggered flashes of recollection: lazy afternoons reading on the front porch, helping tend the garden, and long walks through the countryside while their aunt shared stories about the early days of settlement in Vermont. The valley. One memory remained frustratingly elusive, though her aunt's letter suggested it was crucial to understanding her current situation. She could recall spending time near the creek that ran behind the property, but specific details remained hidden behind a veil of childhood trauma that her mind seemed determined to protect her from accessing. All she could remember was a sense of terror, cold water closing over her head, and then safety, warmth, and the overwhelming relief of being rescued. The next morning brought unexpected visitors in the form of Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Garrett, 2 women who'd been her aunt's closest friends and who clearly felt obligated to welcome Margaret's niece back to the Rave. Community. They arrived bearing fresh baked bread and an abundance of gossip, most of which centered around speculation about Isabelle's intentions regarding the property and her interactions with Duke Harmon. "That man's been different since your aunt passed," Mrs. Henderson confided over coffee and cake. "More watchful, if such a thing is possible. He's always been protective of folks he considers family, but lately, he's been riding past this house near every day, checking to make sure everything's secure." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Some say he's been in love with someone for years, carrying a torch for a woman who's beyond his reach." Mrs. Garrett nodded sagely, clearly enjoying her role as the bearer of romantic speculation. "My Harold saw him once at the general store, buying ribbons and hair combs, fancy things no rancher has use for. When Harold asked about it, Duke just said they were for someone special, but he never courted anyone. In town." She leaned forward with the air of someone sharing particularly juicy gossip. "Harold thinks he's been sending gifts to some lady back east, maybe someone from his past life before he came to Dustwater." The image of the formidable Duke Harmon, carefully selecting feminine accessories, struck Isabelle as both touching and mysterious. She found herself wondering about the woman who'd captured the heart of a man who seemed to trust no one and reveal nothing of his inner life. "Has he ever mentioned where he came from originally?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casually curious. "Not a word in 20 years, Mrs. Henderson replied. "Showed up one day with money to buy the old Morrison Ranch, paid in cash, and never talked about what brought him west. Some folks speculated he was running from the law. Others thought maybe he was fleeing a broken heart, but Duke Harmon's secrets are his own." She paused to sip her coffee thoughtfully. "Your aunt was about the only person in town he'd actually talked to. More than just business transactions, I mean. She seemed to understand something about him that the rest of us missed." After the women left, armed with promises to keep them informed of her plans, Isabelle decided to walk to Miller's Creek in hopes of triggering the memories her aunt's letter suggested were crucial to understanding her situation. The path behind the house led through a meadow dotted with wildflowers and bordered by cottonwood trees whose leaves had turned golden with the approaching winter. The creek itself was smaller than she remembered, perhaps diminished by the dry autumn weather, but the sound of water flowing over smooth stones immediately transported her back to that long-ago summer. She found the oak tree mentioned in her aunt's letter, its massive trunk scarred by decades of wind and weather, but still standing strong and proud beside the water. As she approached the ancient tree, running her hands over its rough bark, Fragments of memory began to surface with startling clarity. She remembered playing alone by the water's edge while her aunt worked in the garden, fascinated by the minnows that darted through the shallows and the way sunlight danced on the surface of the deeper pools. Then, like a door suddenly opening in her mind, the memory crashed over her with overwhelming intensity. She'd been trying to catch a particularly large fish, leaning farther and farther out over the water until her footing gave way on the slippery rocks. The creek had seemed much deeper to her 8-year-old perception, and the current had been stronger than expected, pulling her downstream toward a tangle of fallen branches that could have trapped her beneath the surface. Terror had filled her lungs along with creek water as she struggled to keep her head above the surface, her heavy dress dragging her down despite her desperate attempts to swim. Then strong arms had lifted her from the water, and she'd found herself pressed against the chest of a boy who couldn't have been more than 15, his dark hair dripping with creek water and his blue eyes filled with concern. He'd been tall even then, though nothing like the giant he'd become, and his gentle hands had pushed wet hair from her face as he asked repeatedly if she was hurt. She remembered thinking he was the most beautiful person she'd ever seen, like a prince from one of her fairy tale books, and she'd fallen instantly and completely in love with her rescuer. The memory of what happened next was crystal clear. The boy had carried her back to her aunt's house, where Margaret had fussed over both of them, wrapping Isabelle in warm blankets and insisting the young man stay for supper as a reward for his heroic actions. During that meal, Isabelle had chattered endlessly about her life in Boston, her studies, her dreams of traveling the world, while the boy had listened with the intense attention of someone memorizing every word. When it came time for him to leave, she'd impulsively given him a small photograph of herself that her aunt had taken earlier that summer, writing, "To Duke, my hero," on the back in her careful child's handwriting. Standing beside the oak tree 15 years later, Isabelle felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized the magnitude of Duke Harmon's devotion. He'd been carrying her picture all these years, watching from afar as she grew up and made her life in another world, protecting her aunt's property because it was the closest he could come to protecting her. The gifts Mrs. Garrett had mentioned weren't for some mysterious Eastern lady. They were for her, sent through her aunt to mark birthdays and holidays, a secret guardian's way of staying connected to the girl whose life he'd saved. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her emotional revelation, and she quickly wiped away her tears as Duke himself rode into the meadow on a magnificent black stallion. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent his life on horseback and approached her with obvious concern written on his weathered features. "Are you all right, Miss Crane? I saw you from the ridge and thought you might be in distress," he said, his deep voice gentle with worry. Up close, she could see the silver locket chain visible at the open collar of his shirt, and she knew with absolute certainty what photograph it contained. "I remember you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "I remember the boy who saved me from drowning, who carried me home and listened to all my silly childhood dreams." She watched his face carefully, noting the way his eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. "I remember giving you my picture." For a long moment, Duke stood perfectly still, his hand instinctively moving to touch the locket hidden beneath his shirt. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with suppressed emotion. "You were just a little girl with pigtails and the biggest smile I'd ever seen. You talked about Boston like it was a fairy tale kingdom, and I knew even then that you belonged in a world far away from dusty cow towns and broken-down ranches." He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground between them. "I never expected you to remember. How can I forget the person who saved my life?" Isabelle asked, taking a step closer to the man who'd been her silent protector for so many years. "My aunt's letter said you'd kept a promise all these years." "What promise, Duke?" He raised his eyes to meet hers, and she saw decades of carefully controlled longing in their depths. "I promised her I'd watch over you, make sure you were safe and happy, even if I could never be part of your life. She knew I'd fallen in love with an 8-year-old girl who deserved better than anything I could offer, and she helped me find a way to care for you from a distance." His voice grew rough with emotion. "I've read every letter you sent her, seen every photograph she shared, celebrated every accomplishment and worried through every challenge. You've been the most important part of my life for 15 years, and you never even crack. Knew I existed. The raw honesty in his confession took Isabelle's breath away. She'd spent years in Boston society, surrounded by men who pursued her for her beauty, her family connections, or her modest inheritance, but never before had she encountered someone who'd loved her so completely and asked for nothing in return. "Show me," she whispered, her heart pounding as she gestured toward the locket he still touched unconsciously. Duke's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the silver chain over his head and opened the delicate clasp. Inside was the photograph she'd given him as a child, carefully preserved despite years of wear, showing a gap-toothed girl in pigtails beaming at the camera with innocent joy. On the reverse, her childish handwriting was still legible, "To Duke, my hero. I've carried this next to my heart every day since you gave it to me," he said quietly. "It's reminded me that there's still goodness and beauty in the world, even when everything else seemed dark and hopeless." He looked up at her with eyes that held both love and resignation. "I know you have a life in Boston, important people who care about you, a future that doesn't include dusty frontier towns or broken-down cowboys. I never intended for you to know about any of this. I just wanted to make sure you were safe and that your aunt's wishes were respected." Isabelle felt her heart breaking for the lonely man who'd loved her so faithfully from afar, never allowing himself to hope for more than the privilege of protecting her from a distance. She thought of the shallow relationships she'd known in Boston, the endless round of social obligations and meaningless conversations, the growing sense that she was living someone else's idea of the perfect life, while her own soul withered from neglect. "What if I told you that my life in Boston isn't as wonderful as it might appear from a distance?" she said softly, reaching out to touch his weathered hand. "What if I said that I'd been searching for something real, something meaningful, without even knowing what I was looking for?" She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. What if the 8-year-old girl who fell in love with her hero grew up to be a woman who's been waiting 15 years to find him again? Duke stared at her as if she were an impossible dream made manifest, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and fear. "Isabelle," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "You don't understand what you're saying. I'm not the boy who saved you from the creek anymore. I'm a man with a past I can't change. Enemies I've made, blood on my hands from choices I had to make to survive. You deserve someone clean and respectable, someone who can give you the life you were raised for." "Stop telling me what I deserve," Isabelle said firmly, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I'm 23 years old, Duke Harmon, old enough to make my own decisions about my life and my heart. I've spent years being told what I should want, who I should marry, how I should live, and I'm tired of other people making choices for me." She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes. "The boy who saved me wasn't afraid of deep water or strong currents. Don't let fear keep you from saving me again." Before he could respond with more protests about his unworthiness, she rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring 15 years of unconscious longing into the gentle pressure of her lips against his. For a moment he stood frozen, as if afraid to believe what was happening. Then his arms came around her with careful reverence, holding her as if she were made of spun glass and might disappear at any moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Duke rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. "I've dreamed about this moment so many times I was afraid to believe it could be real," he whispered. "But, Isabelle, you need to understand what you'd be choosing. Blackwood isn't going to give up on that railroad development. And men like him don't take no for an answer politely. If you stay here, if you choose me, you'll be putting yourself in danger. Then, it's a good thing I have the most formidable protector in the territory," she replied with a smile that reminded him powerfully of the fearless child who'd chattered about her dreams during that long-ago supper. "Besides, someone needs to stand up to bullies like Blackwood. My aunt believed this land should stay in local hands, and I intend to honor her wishes." Their romantic interlude was interrupted by the sound of riders approaching at speed. Duke immediately positioned himself in front of Isabelle, his hand moving to his gun as he scanned the tree line for potential threats. When the riders emerged from the cottonwoods, Isabelle was surprised to recognize Sheriff Reynolds, accompanied by 2 of his deputies, all looking grim and purposeful. "Duke, "Miss Crane?" Reynolds called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk. There's been trouble in town." His expression suggested the kind of serious problem that couldn't be resolved with polite conversation. "What kind of trouble?" Duke asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Blackwood's boys paid a visit to the general store and the bank, asking questions about who might be financing resistance to their development plans," Reynolds explained grimly. "When old Morrison suggested they might want to conduct their business more respectfully, they made it clear that accidents could happen to people who interfered with progress." The sheriff's weathered face showed his disgust at having to repeat such threats. "Then they rode out toward your ranch, Duke. I thought you should know they might be planning something." Duke's expression grew deadly serious. "How many men?" he asked tersely, already calculating odds and strategies. "6 that I counted, all armed and looking like they know how to use their weapons," Reynolds replied. "I'd come with you, but I can't officially act against them without proof they've committed a crime, and they've been careful to keep their threats vague and deniable." "I understand," Duke said grimly. "Thanks for the warning." He turned to Isabelle, his face set in lines of determination and worry. "I need to get you back to town where you'll be safe. Whatever happens at the ranch, I don't want you anywhere near it." "Absolutely not," Isabelle said firmly, surprising both men with her vehemence. "If they're targeting you because of me and my property, then running away and hiding won't solve anything. Besides," she added with a smile that was both sweet and stubborn, "I didn't spend all those years in Boston learning to be decorative. I know how to shoot, and I'm not afraid of a fight when the cause is just." Duke stared at her in amazement, seeing perhaps for the first time that the sheltered society belle he'd imagined her to be had grown into a woman of considerable strength and determination. "Isabelle, you don't understand how dangerous this could get. These aren't gentlemen who'll be impressed by your social graces or deterred by appeals to their better nature. They're hired guns who'll do whatever Blackwood pays them to do." "Then it's even more important that I not abandon the people who've been protecting me," she replied steadily. "My aunt trusted you to watch over her interests, and now I'm trusting you to let me stand beside you when it matters most." She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I'm not asking you to let me charge into battle, Duke. I'm asking you to let me be part of the solution instead of just another problem you have to solve alone." Sheriff Reynolds cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I hate to interrupt, but if Blackwood's men are planning something for tonight, we need to decide how we're going to handle this. I can't officially deputize civilians, but I can't officially stop citizens from defending their own property either." His meaningful look suggested he was offering them considerable latitude in how they chose to interpret the law. Duke was quiet for a long moment, weighing options and risks with the careful calculation of a man who'd survived 20 years on the frontier by making hard choices. Finally, he nodded grimly. "My ranch is defensible, and I know the terrain better than they do. If we're going to make a stand, that's where we'll do it." He looked at Isabelle with eyes that held both love and fear. "But if shooting starts, you promise me you'll stay behind cover and let me handle the fighting." "I promise to be careful," Isabelle replied diplomatically, which wasn't quite the same thing, but would have to suffice under the circumstances. As they rode toward Duke's ranch in the fading afternoon light, Isabelle found herself seeing the landscape with new eyes. Every ridge and gully, every stand of trees and stretch of open ground was viewed through the lens of potential conflict, and she began to understand why Duke had chosen this particular piece of land for his home. The ranch house sat on a slight rise that commanded views of the surrounding country, with good water from a spring-fed creek and natural barriers that would funnel attackers into predictable approaches. The house itself was larger than she'd expected, built of solid stone and timber, with the kind of craftsmanship that suggested permanence and pride. Duke had clearly invested considerable time and money in creating a home that could withstand both weather and human threats, with thick walls, shuttered windows, and a roof designed to shed both rain and bullets if necessary. "I built this place to last," Duke explained as they approached the buildings. "After years of never knowing where I'd be sleeping, or whether I'd wake up with a knife in my back, I wanted somewhere that felt safe and permanent." He paused, his expression growing thoughtful. "I used to imagine what it would be like to bring you here someday, to show you the life I'd built while thinking about you. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, with violence and danger threatening everything. Life rarely happens the way we plan it, Isabelle observed, dismounting from her horse with growing confidence in her riding skills. But sometimes, the unexpected turns out better than what we originally hoped for. She gestured toward the ranch house with genuine admiration. This is beautiful, Duke. It's exactly the kind of home where someone could build a real life, raise a family, create something lasting and meaningful. The look he gave her was so filled with longing and hope that it took her breath away. Do you really mean that? He asked quietly. Or are you just being kind to a foolish man who's been chasing an impossible dream? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching riders ended their conversation and brought them both back to the immediate reality of their dangerous situation. 6 men rode into the ranch yard with the casual arrogance of people accustomed to intimidating others through superior numbers and firepower. Blackwood himself wasn't among them, but their leader was a lean, cold-eyed man who wore his guns with the practiced ease of a professional killer. Duke Harmon, the man called out, making no effort to dismount or observe the normal courtesies of frontier hospitality. I'm Jake Morrison, and I work for Mr. Blackwood. He sent me to deliver a message about the future of this valley and your place in it. I'm listening. Duke replied evenly, though Isabelle could see the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he positioned himself to have clear access to his weapons. Morrison's smile was thin and predatory. Mr. Blackwood's been more than patient with the folks in this valley, offering fair prices for land that's not worth much more than grazing rights. But patience has its limits, especially when certain individuals keep interfering with legitimate business negotiations. End quote. His cold gaze moved between Duke and Isabelle with obvious threat. The railroad's coming through whether people like it or not. Those who cooperate will profit handsomely. Those who don't, well, they might find frontier life more dangerous than they expected. And if I told you that Miss Crane and I aren't interested in selling, regardless of the price? Duke asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made smart men think twice about their next words. Then I'd have to remind you that accidents happen out here in the wilderness, Morrison replied with mock sympathy. Cattle stampedes, house fires, falls from horses, snake bites, all sorts of unfortunate incidents that can befall folks who don't pay proper attention to their safety. He paused meaningfully. Of course, Mr. Blackwood would be devastated if anything happened to such respectable citizens. He might even feel obligated to buy their property from grieving relatives as a gesture of community support. Isabelle felt anger building in her chest at the casual way these men discussed threats against innocent people. Mr. Morrison, she said, stepping forward despite Duke's protective gesture, I believe you're mistaken about the nature of your employer's rights in this matter. My aunt's property is legally mine, and I have no intention of selling to anyone, regardless of their threats or intimidation tactics. Morrison's expression grew ugly as he focused his attention on her. You're a long way from Boston, lady. Out here, legal rights don't mean much if you're not alive to exercise them. His hand moved meaningfully toward his gun. Mr. Blackwood specifically asked me to encourage you to reconsider your position before you make any decisions you can't take back. The threat against Isabelle triggered something primal and dangerous in Duke's demeanor. His entire body went still in a way that reminded her of a mountain cat preparing to strike, and when he spoke, his voice carried the promise of violence held barely in check. Morrison, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Threatening Miss Crane puts you and your men in a category of problem that gets solved permanently. Big words from one man facing 6, Morrison sneered, though Isabelle noticed that several of his companions seemed less confident than their leader about the odds they were facing. You boys might want to ask around town about Duke Harmon before you commit to this course of action. Sheriff Reynolds' voice cut through the tension as he and his deputies rode into the ranch yard. The stories about what happened to the last group of hired guns who thought they could intimidate folks in this valley aren't pleasant bedtime reading. Morrison's confidence faltered slightly at the sight of official law enforcement, but he rallied quickly. Sheriff, we're just having a friendly conversation about business opportunities. No laws being broken here. His tone was carefully neutral, but his hand remained near his weapon. Funny thing about friendly conversations, Reynolds replied conversationally. They usually don't require 6 armed men making veiled threats against local citizens. Seems to me you boys might want to ride back to town and reconsider your approach to community relations. The standoff stretched taut as both sides evaluated their options and calculated risks. Isabelle found herself holding her breath, acutely aware that the wrong word or sudden movement could trigger a gunfight that would leave people dead in the dirt of Duke's ranch yard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scene, and she could hear the normal sounds of ranch life. Cattle lowing in distant pastures, and horses moving restlessly in the corral, providing a surreal backdrop to the deadly serious confrontation. Morrison finally broke the silence, his voice tight with frustrated anger. "This isn't over, Harmon. Mr. Blackwood's railroad is coming through this valley, and anyone who stands in the way is going to get rolled over. The smart money says you should take his offer while it's still on the table." "Why?" He wheeled his horse around and signaled his men to follow. "Think carefully about what you're choosing to protect, and whether it's worth dying for." As the riders disappeared into the gathering dusk, Duke finally allowed himself to relax slightly, though Isabelle could see that he remained alert and ready for trouble. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "Morrison's not the type to give up after one warning, and Blackwood's invested too much in this development to let a couple of holdouts derail his plans." "Then we better be ready for them," Sheriff Reynolds observed. "Practically, I can probably manage to have deputies in the area for the next few nights, but I can't guarantee official protection indefinitely. Sooner or later, you're going to have to settle this permanently, one way or another." After the sheriff and his men departed, Duke and Isabelle found themselves alone as darkness settled over the ranch. The house felt different now, charged with the awareness of both the danger they faced and the profound changes in their relationship. Duke moved through the familiar spaces with practiced efficiency, checking weapons and securing the building against potential attack, while Isabelle helped where she could and tried to process the reality of her transformed circumstances. "I should take you back to town," Duke said eventually, though his tone suggested he knew she wouldn't agree to leave. "Whatever happens here tonight, I don't want you caught in the middle of it." "We've already had this conversation," Isabelle replied firmly. "I'm not running away and leaving you to face this alone. Besides," she added with a smile that mixed determination with feminine mischief, "I told you I know how to shoot. It's time I proved it." Duke studied her face in the lamplight, seeing perhaps for the first time the steel beneath her refined exterior. "Your aunt mentioned in her letters that you'd grown into a strong woman, but I don't think I fully understood what she meant until now." He moved closer, his expression growing tender. "I spent 15 years imagining what it would be like to have you here, in my home, but I never dreamed you'd be standing beside me ready to fight for what we're building together." The simple word "together" sent warmth spreading through Isabelle's chest, banishing the chill of fear and uncertainty that had plagued her since Morrison's threats. "Is that what we're doing?" she asked softly. "Building something together?" "If you'll have me," Duke replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I'm not the prince from your childhood fairy tales. I'm a man with more scars than polish, more enemies than friends, more regrets than accomplishments. But I love you, Isabelle. I've loved you since you were 8 years old and gave me your picture, and I'll love you until the day I die, whether that's tomorrow or 50 years from now." She reached up to cup his weathered face in her soft hands, marveling at the contrast between his rugged exterior and the gentleness in his blue eyes. "You're wrong about one thing," she whispered. "You are exactly the prince from my fairy tales. You saved me from drowning. You've protected me for years without asking for anything in return, and now you're ready to fight dragons to keep me safe. What more could any woman ask for in a hero?" Their kiss was deeper this time, filled with the passion of adults who'd found each other after years of separation and the desperate urgency of people who might not survive to see another sunrise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Duke rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. "Whatever happens tonight," he said quietly, "I want you to know that these past 2 days, getting to hold you and hear you say you love me, have been worth 15 years of waiting and wondering." "Nothing's going to happen to us," Isabelle said with fierce conviction. "We've waited too long to find each other to let some railroad developer and his hired guns destroy our chance at happiness." As if summoned by her defiant words, the sound of approaching riders drifted across the night air. Duke immediately extinguished the lamps and moved to a window that offered a view of the ranch approach. 6 riders, maybe 7, he reported grimly. "They're trying to be quiet, but horses make noise whether you want them to or not." Isabelle joined him at the window, her heart pounding but her hands steady as she checked the rifle Duke had given her. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "They'll try to surround the house and force us out, probably by setting fire to the outbuildings first," Duke explained tersely. "The stone walls will protect us from most gunfire, but if they manage to get the house burning, we'll have to make a run for it." He paused, studying the shadowy figures moving through his property. "The good news is that I know every inch of this land, and they don't. If we have to leave the house, I can get us to cover they won't expect." The attack began with the crackle of flames from the direction of the barn, confirming Duke's prediction about their tactics. Orange light flickered against the windows as Morrison's men used fire to flush their prey into the open, where guns could finish the job. Shouted orders, and the thunder of hoofbeats, indicated that the attackers were positioning themselves to cover all possible escape routes from the house. "Come out, Harmon," Morrison's voice carried clearly across the ranch yard. "Bring the woman, and we'll make this quick and clean. Keep hiding, and we'll burn you out slow and painful." Duke's answer was a rifle shot that knocked one of the attackers from his horse and sent the others scrambling for cover. "That's my response to your generous offer, Morrison," he shouted back. "If you want us, come and take us." The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Isabelle had experienced in her sheltered life, but she found herself responding with calm efficiency that surprised even Duke. She proved to be an excellent shot, covering windows while he moved between positions, and her steady nerve under fire reminded him that courage often ran deeper than surface appearances might suggest. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, with bullets shattering window glass and thudding into wooden shutters while the barn continued to burn in the background. Morrison's men had superior numbers, but Duke's knowledge of his property and the defensive advantages of the stone house kept them pinned down and unable to achieve a decisive victory. The turning point came when Sheriff Reynolds and a hastily assembled posse of townsmen arrived with guns blazing, having been alerted by the glow of the fire visible for miles across the dark landscape. Caught between the house and the arriving lawmen, Morrison's surviving gunmen found themselves outflanked and outnumbered. "This is Sheriff Reynolds," came the shouted command from the darkness beyond the ranch yard. "Throw down your weapons and surrender. You're surrounded and outgunned." Two of Morrison's men immediately dropped their rifles and raised their hands, clearly having no desire to die for Blackwood's railroad development. Morrison himself and two others tried to fight their way out, spurring their horses toward what they hoped was a gap in the posse's line. But Duke's rifle spoke again, and Morrison tumbled from his saddle to lie motionless in the dirt. The remaining gunmen surrendered without further resistance, and an eerie quiet settled over the ranch as the sounds of battle faded into the night. Duke and Isabelle emerged from the house to find Sheriff Reynolds supervising the arrest of the surviving attackers, while townsmen worked to prevent the barn fire from spreading to other buildings. "Looks like Blackwood's going to need a new approach to his business negotiations," Reynolds observed grimly as he surveyed the scene. "Morrison won't be making any more threats, and I doubt these other boys will be eager to continue working for someone who sends them into situations like this." Duke nodded, though his expression remained watchful and alert. "Blackwood's not going to give up just because he lost some hired guns. Men like him don't take defeat gracefully, especially when it's public and embarrassing." He put his arm around Isabelle's shoulders, drawing her close against his side. "We may have won this battle, but the war's not over yet. Then we better be ready for whatever comes next," Isabelle said firmly, leaning into Duke's protective embrace while keeping her rifle ready in case of further threats. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not backing down from bullies who think they can take what doesn't belong to them." The next few days brought a parade of visitors to the ranch as word of the gun battle spread throughout the region. Some came out of curiosity, eager to hear first-hand accounts of the dramatic confrontation, while others arrived to express support for Duke and Isabelle's stand against outside developers. Most surprising was the delegation of local ranchers and farmers who offered to help rebuild the burned barn and provide additional security against future attacks. "Folks around here don't take kindly to hired guns threatening their neighbors," explained old Pete Morrison, a grizzled cattleman whose family had been among the first settlers in the valley. "You and Miss Crane made a stand for all of us against those railroad vultures. The least we can do is make sure you have the support you need to keep fighting." The community response revealed something Isabelle hadn't fully understood about frontier life: the way isolated families and individuals came together when faced with common threats. These weren't people who normally socialized extensively or involved themselves in each other's private affairs, but they recognized that an attack on one homestead was ultimately a threat to all of them. Blackwood himself arrived 3 days after the failed attack, accompanied by a small army of lawyers, accountants, and new security personnel. His approach was more sophisticated this time, focusing on legal challenges to property ownership, environmental concerns about railroad construction, and financial incentives designed to make resistance seem foolish and short-sighted. "Miss Crane," he said during their meeting at the lawyer's office, his manner now carefully respectful and professional, "I deeply regret the unfortunate incident at Mr. Harmon's ranch. I want you to know that Morrison was acting entirely without my authorization, and his methods were completely contrary to my instructions." His tone suggested injured innocence at having been betrayed by subordinates, though everyone present understood this was legal maneuvering designed to distance him from criminal liability. "How fortunate that you can disclaim responsibility so easily," Isabelle replied coolly. "I'm sure Morrison's widow will be comforted to know his death was just an unfortunate misunderstanding." Blackwood's facade of regret slipped slightly, revealing the cold calculation beneath his polished exterior. "Business can be complicated, Miss Crane, especially when dealing with volatile individuals who might misinterpret instructions. That's why I'm hoping we can reach an amicable agreement that serves everyone's craft interests." He gestured toward his pile of legal documents. "I'm prepared to triple my original offer for your property, with additional compensation for any inconvenience you may have experienced." "My position hasn't changed, Mr. Blackwood," Isabelle said firmly. "The property isn't for sale at any price. My aunt wanted this land to remain in local hands, and I intend to honor her wishes, even if honoring those wishes puts you and Mr. Harmon in continued danger." Blackwood pressed, allowing a hint of threat to color his supposedly concerned tone. "The railroad is coming through this valley regardless of individual property rights. Eminent domain laws allow the government to acquire private land for public works projects, and I have considerable influence with the Bakken territorial authorities." Duke spoke for the first time during the meeting, his voice carrying the quiet menace that had made Morrison's men think twice about their career choices. "Blackwood, you've made 2 serious mistakes. First, you threatened Miss Crane, which puts you in the same category as Morrison. Second, you assume that legal maneuvering and political corruption will succeed where hired guns failed." He leaned forward slightly, his blue eyes cold as winter ice. "You're about to discover that some problems can't be solved with money and influence." After Blackwood and his entourage departed with promises of renewed legal action and vague hints about federal intervention, Duke and Isabelle found themselves facing the reality of a prolonged struggle against a wealthy and determined opponent. The developer had resources they couldn't match, and connections in territorial government that could potentially override local property rights. But they had something he lacked: the support of a community that had decided to make their fight a collective cause. "We need to think strategically about this," Isabelle observed, as they reviewed the legal documents Blackwood had left behind. "He's not going to give up, and we can't fight him indefinitely using the same tactics that worked against Morrison's gunmen." She paused, studying the railroad survey maps that showed the proposed route through the valley. "But maybe we don't have to fight him directly. Maybe we can find a way to make his railroad development economically unfeasible." Duke looked at her with growing admiration and curiosity. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, recognizing the calculating intelligence that had helped her navigate Boston society's complex social and financial networks. Blackwood's entire plan depends on acquiring a continuous corridor of land for his railroad spur, Isabelle explained, pointing to the survey maps. If even one critical property owner refuses to sell, the entire project becomes much more complicated and expensive. Right now, he thinks we're the only holdouts. But what if we weren't? Over the following weeks, Isabelle threw herself into organizing resistance to the railroad development with the same skill and determination she'd once applied to Boston charity work and social campaigns. She wrote visited neighboring ranches and farms, explaining how the proposed railroad would affect not just individual property values, but the entire character of their community. Her education and social graces, which had once seemed irrelevant to sea frontier life, proved invaluable in building coalitions and presenting persuasive arguments to people who might have dismissed Duke's more direct approach. The turning point came when she discovered that Blackwood's survey maps showed the railroad route passing directly through the valley's main water source, Miller's Creek, which supplied irrigation for dozens of farms and ranches. Armed with this information and her growing understanding of territorial water rights law, she was able to demonstrate that the railroad development would constitute a threat to the entire region's agricultural economy. If they dam or divert Miller's Creek for their construction needs, she explained to a packed meeting at the church, every farm and ranch in the valley could lose their water rights. Blackwood's promising prosperity through railroad development, but he's not mentioning that his prosperity would come at the cost of destroying the agricultural base that sustained this community for 30 years. The revelation galvanized opposition in ways that abstract discussions of property rights and outside interference had not. Farmers and ranchers who might have been tempted by Blackwood's financial offers suddenly understood that selling their land could mean destroying their neighbors' livelihoods and the entire valley's future. Duke watched Isabelle's transformation from sheltered society belle to effective community organizer with a mixture of pride and amazement. "I always knew you were special," he told her one evening as they walked hand in hand along Miller's Creek, "but I never imagined you'd become the general in our war against Blackwood's railroad." "I had good teachers," she replied, squeezing his hand affectionately. "Aunt Margaret always said that privilege comes with responsibility, and my Boston education gave me tools I never realized could be useful for fighting corporate greed." She paused to watch the creek water flowing peacefully in the moonlight. "Besides, I finally found something worth fighting for." Their romantic moment was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Reynolds, who brought news that would change the entire dynamic of their conflict with Blackwood. "I just received a telegram from the territorial capital," he announced grimly. "Blackwood's political connections apparently extend higher than we thought. There's going to be a federal investigation into alleged interference with interstate commerce, and they're specifically looking at the gun battle at your ranch as evidence of violent resistance to lawful business activities." Duke's expression grew grim as he contemplated the implications. "Federal investigation means federal marshals, and they won't be as sympathetic to local concerns as you've been, Sheriff. Blackwood's probably convinced them that we're dangerous radicals, threatening the expansion of American commerce and civilization." "Worse than that," Reynolds continued. "The investigation is being led by Marshal Crawford, who has a reputation for resolving these kinds of disputes in favor of whoever has the most political influence in the end. Deepest pockets. If he decides that your resistance to the railroad constitutes criminal interference with federal commerce, he has the authority to arrest anyone involved and seize property as evidence." Isabelle felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. They'd been fighting a local battle against a private developer, but now they were facing the full power of the federal government backed by political corruption and corporate money. "How long do we have before this marshal arrives?" she asked, her mind already racing through possible responses to this new threat. "Maybe a week, possibly less," Reynolds replied. "Crawford's already on his way from Denver with a full complement of federal agents and the legal authority to do pretty much whatever he thinks necessary to resolve the situation." He paused, his expression growing apologetic. "I have to warn you both that there may not be much I can do to help once federal law enforcement gets involved. My authority as county sheriff doesn't extend to interfering with federal operations." After the sheriff departed, Duke and Isabelle sat in silence for a long time, each lost in thought about their increasingly desperate situation. The community support they built and the legal strategies they developed were meaningless against federal intervention, especially when that intervention was guided by corrupt officials working in Blackwood's interests. "We could leave," Duke said eventually, though his tone suggested the idea was distasteful to him. "I have money saved, and there are other places where we could build a life together. Colorado, California, maybe even back east, where your connections could help us start over." He paused, staring out at the ranch he'd built with his own hands. "It would mean abandoning everything I've worked for, but keeping you safe is more important than any piece of land." Isabelle was quiet for a moment, considering the option he'd presented. The prospect of fleeing to safety was tempting, especially when measured against the possibility of federal prison or worse. But something in her rebelled against the idea of letting Blackwood's corruption triumph through intimidation and abuse of government power. "What would happen to the people who've supported us?" she asked finally. "The farmers and ranchers who've taken a stand based on my arguments about water rights and community preservation? If we run away, they'll be left to face federal investigation and possible prosecution without the resources to defend themselves." Duke nodded grimly, recognizing the moral dilemma she'd identified. They'd probably be accused of conspiracy and sedition, branded as dangerous radicals who threaten American progress and prosperity. Blackwood would use our flight as evidence that we were criminals who knew we couldn't defend our actions in court. "Then we stay and fight," Isabelle said firmly, her voice carrying the same determined tone that had defied Morrison's threats and organized community resistance to the railroad development. "If Marshall Crawford is corrupt, then we expose his corruption. If the federal government is being manipulated by corporate interests, then we find a way to make that manipulation public and embarrassing." "Isabelle," Duke said gently, "we're talking about challenging the federal government and some of the most powerful men in the territory. The odds against us aren't just long, they're astronomical. Even if we could prove corruption, who would we prove it to? The same political system that sent Crawford here in the first place?" She was quiet for a moment, then smiled with the kind of determination that reminded him powerfully of the fearless child who'd chattered about her dreams during that long-ago summer. "Do you remember what you told Morrison when he threatened us? You said that some problems get solved permanently." She paused, meeting his eyes with steady resolve. Maybe it's time to solve the Blackwood problem permanently. The plan that emerged from their desperate brainstorming session was audacious to the point of seeming impossible. But desperation often bred creativity in ways that careful planning could not. If they couldn't fight Blackwood's corruption through legal channels, they would expose it so dramatically and publicly that even his political protectors would be forced to abandon him to save their own reputations. "We need evidence," Isabelle said, her mind working through the complexities of their situation with the analytical skills her Boston education had developed. "Concrete proof that Blackwood is using federal authority illegally, that Marshall Crawford is working for corporate interests rather than justice, and that the entire railroad development is based on fraud and corruption. Evidence like that would be kept in Blackwood's private files, probably in his hotel suite or his temporary business office," Duke observed practically. "Getting access to those documents would require breaking and entering, theft, and probably a dozen other federal crimes. We'd be risking everything on the chance that we could find proof and get it to honest authorities before Crawford arrests us all. Then we better make sure we don't get caught," Isabelle replied with a smile that mixed determination with just enough reckless confidence to worry Duke considerably. The next 3 days were spent in careful reconnaissance and preparation. Duke used his knowledge of the town and his contacts among local merchants to gather intelligence about Blackwood's security arrangements, daily routines, and business operations. Isabelle employed her social skills to cultivate relationships with hotel staff, clerks, and other people who might provide access to information about their target's activities. What they discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Blackwood was indeed operating with casual disregard for legal and the ethical constraints, confident that his political connections would protect him from any consequences of his actions. His correspondence with territorial officials revealed a web of bribery, intimidation, and abuse of government authority that extended far beyond their little valley. The evidence they needed was there, but obtaining it would require taking risks that could easily result in their deaths or federal prison sentences. "He keeps the most sensitive documents in a locked strongbox in his hotel suite," Isabelle reported after an afternoon spent charming information from chambermaids and desk clerks. "The box is hidden behind a false panel in his bedroom wardrobe, and he checks it every morning and evening like clockwork." She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "The hotel staff say he's been drinking heavily in the evenings, probably because the pressure of managing this development is getting to him. If we time our approach correctly, we might catch him when he's less alert than usual." Duke studied the rough floor plan she'd sketched of Blackwood's suite, noting potential entry points and escape routes with the tactical awareness of someone who'd survived similar dangerous situations. The window overlooking the alley would give us access without going through the main hotel. But it's a 15-foot climb, and there's no guarantee we could get down quickly if something goes wrong. He paused, meeting her eyes with obvious concern. Isabelle, I want you to understand what we're risking here. If we get caught, Crawford will use it as evidence that we're dangerous criminals who justify whatever harsh measures he decides to take. We could be facing life in federal prison, or worse. I understand the risks, she replied steadily, but I also understand what happens if we do nothing. Blackwood destroys our community, steals our land, and corrupts our government with complete impunity. At least this way, we have a chance to fight back and expose the truth. The night they chose for their desperate gamble was moonless and cloudy, providing the darkness they needed for their approach to the hotel. Duke had insisted on going alone. But Isabelle had countered that her smaller size and social skills might prove crucial if they encountered unexpected obstacles. Their compromise was a careful plan that relied on stealth and timing, rather than confrontation, with multiple contingencies for escape if their mission went wrong. Moving through Dustwater's empty streets like shadows, they reached the alley behind the hotel without incident. The climb to Blackwood's window proved more challenging than anticipated, requiring Duke to boost Isabelle up to the fire escape before following with the athletic grace of someone accustomed to physical challenges. The window itself was unlocked, a piece of carelessness that suggested Blackwood's arrogance extended to basic security precautions. Inside the darkened suite, they could hear Blackwood's drunken snoring from the bedroom, providing both an opportunity and a constant reminder of how close they were to discovery. Working by touch in near-total darkness, they located the wardrobe and the hidden panel Isabelle had learned about from the hotel staff. The strong box within was locked, but Duke's frontier skills included certain practical abilities he'd never mentioned to Belle, Isabelle, and the lock yielded to his careful ministrations with surprising ease. The documents inside the strong box were exactly what they'd hoped to find. Correspondence with territorial officials that detailed specific bribes and political favors, contracts with railroad companies that revealed the true scope of Blackwood's development plans, and most damaging of all, instructions to Marshal Crawford that made it clear the federal investigation was a coordinated effort to circumvent local property rights through abuse of government authority. "This is enough to destroy him," Isabelle whispered as they carefully photographed the documents using a small camera Duke had acquired for the purpose. "These letters prove that he's corrupted federal officials and violated territorial law on a massive scale. Even his political protectors won't be able to defend this level of blatant criminality." Their moment of triumph was interrupted by the sound of movement from the bedroom, followed by Blackwood's voice calling out groggily, "Who's there? I heard something in the sitting room." The sounds of someone stumbling around in the dark suggested that their target was awake and potentially discovering their presence. Duke immediately began returning the documents to the strong box while Isabelle prepared their escape route through the window. They had perhaps seconds before Blackwood emerged from the bedroom with a lamp or weapon, and their entire plan depended on getting away without being identified or caught with the evidence of their break-in. The escape through the hotel window and down the fire escape was accomplished with desperate speed but fortunately without attracting attention from other guests or hotel staff. By the time Blackwood managed to rouse security and investigate his suspicions, Duke and Isabelle were safely away from the hotel and making their way through back alleys toward the hiding place where they'd left their horses. "Did we get everything we need?" Duke asked as they rode hard toward his ranch, putting distance between themselves and the scene of their crime. "More than enough," Isabelle replied, clutching the camera that contained photographic evidence of Blackwood's corruption. "The question now is how to use it effectively before Crawford arrives and starts making arrests." The plan they developed for exposing Blackwood's crimes relied on publicity and political pressure, rather than local law enforcement, which they knew was powerless against federal authority. Using contacts Isabelle had cultivated during her years in Boston society, they arranged to have copies of the incriminating documents sent to newspaper editors in Denver, San Francisco, and even New York, along with detailed explanations of how federal authority was being abused to serve corporate interests at the expense of local communities. The response was immediate and dramatic. Within days, headlines across the Western Territories were trumpeting the scandal of federal corruption and corporate greed in Dustwater. Editorial writers who normally supported railroad development found themselves forced to condemn the blatant abuse of government authority revealed in Blackwood's correspondence. Most importantly, territorial officials who'd been cooperating with the developer suddenly found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about their own involvement in the scheme. Marshal Crawford arrived in Dustwater 3 days after the story broke nationally. But instead of the triumphant federal intervention Blackwood had orchestrated, he found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from newspaper correspondents, territorial investigators, and his own federal superiors who were suddenly concerned about the legal and political implications of their involvement in the affair. "This is a disaster," Crawford confided to Blackwood during their first meeting, unaware that Duke and Isabelle were listening from the next room through an arrangement they'd made with the hotel staff. "Washington is demanding explanations for how classified federal communications ended up in newspapers across the country. The territorial governors calling for investigations into corruption and federal law enforcement. My career is over unless I can find a way to contain this scandal." End quote. Blackwood's response revealed the true extent of his desperation and moral bankruptcy. "Then arrest everyone involved in stealing those documents," he snarled. "Charge them with espionage, sedition, whatever it takes to discredit their accusations and justify our actions. Once they're in federal custody, we can control the narrative and present this as a triumph of law and order over dangerous radicals." "It's too late for that," Crawford replied grimly. "The documents are authentic federal communications, which means investigating their theft would require admitting they were legitimate government materials used for illegal purposes. My superiors have made it clear that my job now is to minimize federal exposure to bias. This scandal, not to help you salvage your railroad development." The conversation that followed revealed the complete collapse of Blackwood's carefully constructed scheme. Without federal protection, his railroad development was subject to normal territorial law and local property rights. Without the threat of federal prosecution, the community resistance that Isabelle had organized could challenge his land acquisitions through legitimate legal channels. Most importantly, without the intimidation and corruption that had been his primary tools, he was just another developer with more ambition than resources trying to succeed in a competitive market. "We won," Isabelle said quietly, as she and Duke listened to Blackwood's empire crumbling in the next room. "He's lost his federal protection, his political connections, and probably most of his financial backing. The railroad might still be built eventually, but it will have to be done legally and ethically, with fair compensation for property owners and respect for community concerns." End quote. Duke pulled her into his arms, marveling at how this elegant society woman had become the most formidable opponent Blackwood had ever encountered. "We won because you refused to give up or run away," he said softly. "I've been protecting you from a distance for 15 years, but these past weeks, you've been protecting all of us through courage and intelligence I never imagined you possessed." The aftermath of their victory was surprisingly anticlimactic. Blackwood left Dustwater within a week, his railroad development abandoned, and his reputation destroyed. Marshal Crawford was recalled to Washington to face disciplinary hearings that would effectively end his career in federal law enforcement. Most of the territorial officials who'd been cooperating with the scheme quietly distanced themselves from the scandal and focused on rebuilding their damaged credibility. For Duke and Isabelle, the end of the immediate crisis meant they could finally focus on their personal future rather than just their survival. The ranch house that had been a fortress during their conflict with Blackwood was transformed into a home where they could build the life they both dreamed about during their years of separation. "I have a confession to make," Isabelle said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "When I was 8 years old and you saved me from drowning, I decided I was going to marry you someday. Every man I met in Boston was measured against the memory of a boy who'd been brave and gentle and kind to a frightened little girl." Duke smiled, remembering that long-ago summer when he'd been a lonely teenager who'd fallen in love with an impossible dream. "I have a confession too," he replied, pulling out the silver locket he'd carried for 15 years. I used to imagine what it would be like when you came back to me, but I never dared hope it would be as perfect as this." He opened the locket to reveal her childhood photograph, now joined by a newer image he'd acquired during her recent stay in Dustwater. The little girl in pigtails grew up to be everything I dreamed she would be, and more than I ever deserved. Isabelle took the locket from his weathered hands, studying both photographs with tears in her eyes. "You carried my picture next to your heart for 15 years, she whispered, "and I spent those same 15 years unconsciously searching for the boy who saved me. We were always meant to find each other again." Their wedding took place 6 months later, in the same church where Isabelle had organized the community resistance to Blackwood's Railroad. The entire valley turned out to celebrate the union of the society belle and the giant cowboy who'd found their way back to each other against impossible odds. Sheriff Reynolds performed the ceremony, having been ordained for the occasion, and even old Pete Morrison shed a tear during the vows. "They said Duke Harmon was heartless," Mrs. Henderson whispered to Mrs. Darrett during the reception. "But look how gentle he is with his bride. A truly heartless man doesn't carry a woman's picture for 15 years and then fight half the federal government to protect her. Some hearts are just too big to show on them." Outside, Mrs. Garrett replied wisely, "Takes the right person to bring out what's been hidden all along." As Duke and Isabelle danced their first dance as husband and wife, she noticed him touching the silver locket that now contained both their wedding photograph and her original childhood picture. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking about promises kept," he replied, his blue eyes bright with tears he wasn't ashamed to shed. "I promised your aunt I'd watch over you, and I promised myself I'd love you until the day I died. Now I get to promise you that every day for the rest of our lives will be better than the last." The music swirled around them as the community that had supported their fight against corruption now celebrated their triumph over the loneliness and separation that had kept them apart for so long. In the distance, Miller's Creek continued its eternal flow toward the mountains, carrying with it the stories of all who'd found love, lost it, and miraculously found it again in the shadow of the giant cowboy who'd never stopped believing in the power of a promise made to a drowning child. Years later, when their own children played by that same creek, Isabelle would tell them the story of how their father had saved her twice, once from drowning and once from a life without true love. And Duke would show them the silver locket that had carried their mother's picture through 15 years of waiting, teaching them that some promises are worth keeping no matter how long it takes or how much it costs. The giant cowboy they'd called Heartless had carried a heart big enough to hold 15 years of patient love, and in the end, that love had conquered everything that tried to stand in its way. In a world that often seemed to reward cruelty and selfishness, their story proved that devotion and sacrifice could still triumph, and that some fairy tales were too true and too beautiful to be anything but real. The railroad eventually came to the valley, built by honest developers who respected property rights and community concerns. The land prospered, the people flourished, and Duke and Isabelle's ranch became a symbol of what could be accomplished when love and determination refused to surrender to corruption and greed. They lived happily ever after, not because their story was a fairy tale, but because they'd chosen to make it one through courage, faith, and the unshakable belief that some promises are sacred enough to be worth any sacrifice.